We've been talking a lot lately about should the Sabres fire Kevyn Adams? When will the Sabres fire Kevyn Adams? Well, let's play a little what if. If the Buffalo Sabres do fire Kevyn Adams, what could they be looking at to replace him at general manager? We'll get to a bunch of different ideas for who could be the next GM if they make a move. Coming up here in the Locked On Sabres podcast.
You're Locked On Sabres, your daily podcast on the Buffalo Sabres. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into today's edition of the Locked On Sabres podcast with Sneaky Joe DiBiase here on a Thursday. And thanks for making us your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get your podcast. That does include our YouTube channel where you can watch the show as well. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is presented by FanDuel. You can continue to roll through the season with some big returns on FanDuel. New customers place a $5 bet, and you get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's visit FanDuel.com to get started. Sneaky Joe DiBiase on today's show. Gonna talk a lot about general managers and if the Sabres do move on from Kevyn Adams, whether that be coming up soon, if this losing streak continues, maybe in the next little bit. If not, maybe by the end of the season. And this is something that you could file away, stick in your back pocket, maybe pick your favorite as an idea in the back of your mind for the Sabres making this move if they, again, get to it. It is an if. I don't know that they will ever do it. Even if this season finishes where they're like 30th in the NHL, I'll still be hesitant to declare, oh yeah, they're going to fire him. It's almost uncharted territory because Adams is not a typical GM. He was a Pagula guy that worked in the organization long before he was the GM, and he did not have the resume of a proven GM or somebody that on any other team would get the job. So he was treated differently at the start. So you almost have to wonder, is he going to be treated differently as you get towards the end? So with all that being said, let's prepare ourselves. If they do it, what do we like? What's likely? Internal, veteran ideas, external, up-and-coming GMs that would be first time on the job. I got a lot of names and a lot of research on a lot of different candidates that we can get to today on the Locked On Sabres podcast. If you would like to reach out with somebody that's your favorite idea or somebody that you have in mind is like, I'd like to see that guy run the Buffalo Sabres, you could reach out. You could hit us up. I'm on Blue Sky at Sneaky Joe. Of course, you can still hit us up on Twitter at Locked On Sabres. You can hit us up on our text club. And if you're not already a subscriber and you want to become one, all you do, you go to the website, joinsubtext.com/LockedOnSabres. You'll get our texts. You will, whether it's on practice updates, lines, injuries, maybe during a game, as we go through goals and we break stuff down, or we just rant and rave about this team driving us nuts. Today, if you're in the text club, you would have got our injury updates from practice today. Got good news and bad news. We'll start with the good news. Rasmus Dahlin back practicing again on Thursday, but this time he was quarterbacking the number one power play unit. And we had a different look for the power play unit, by the way. You had Zach for the number one unit. You had Zach Benson in front. You had Jack Quinn and JJ Peterka on the wings for one-timers. You had Dahlin at the top, and then you had Tage Thompson in the high slot. That's something I have not seen them try. I'm not necessarily optimistic about that, and it doesn't make a lot of logistical sense to me, but at the same time, it's something they haven't tried. Their power play has stunk for like 14 months now. Give it a shot. Let's see what happens. I'm not going to criticize him for that. But Dahlin back on the power play unit, I think indicates that he is ready to go for Friday's game against the Toronto Maple Leafs. So my guess is you are going to see Rasmus Dahlin back on the ice for the Sabres when they meet Toronto on Friday. And remember, Toronto is the away team in this game. But I hazard to guess that it's going to be like 16,000 Leaf fans. I don't know if that number is really an exaggeration. I kind of think it isn't. But maybe it'll be closer to like 13,000 Leaf fans. But I would take the over on that one specifically. The other injury updates, though, on the bad side of things, Ryan McLeod, absent, although Lindy Ruff called it a maintenance day and that he's questionable for the Leafs game. So we'll see. No Jordan Greenway, and Jordan Greenway is having surgery and is out long term. So he was out, came back, got re-injured, and they anticipate, like this wasn't even confirmed. It wasn't like, oh, 100% he'll be back this year. They anticipate that Greenway will return at some point this year. So this is going to be a while. Like he's out till the spring at least. And that almost made it sound like there is a shot he doesn't return this season, although maybe unlikely. So tough, right? Because Jordan Greenway was somebody that I had no hopes for this year. I would have told you before the season, I'm sure I did, that he would be my healthy scratch to start the season. I was just not impressed with him at all last year. To me, he looked slow. He looked lethargic. He didn't look energized. He isn't producing much offense. And then this year started, and he looked like all of those things. Not to say he was necessarily like fast, but he looked more energetic. He would get in on the forecheck. He looked like he was tough to handle for the opponent. He was chipping the odd puck in once in a while for a goal. That line was producing offense with Ryan McLeod and Jason Zucker. And that third line that looked like a good third line for the first month and a half of the season is not going to exist going forward. And by the time Greenway's back, hey, maybe Jason Zucker is not even on the team anymore because he's on a one-year deal and you've got a trade deadline. So tough to see that line is not going to be together. Tough that Greenway isn't able to capitalize on what has been a very good season for him. And tough to think that you might not get many more Jordan Greenway games in a Buffalo Sabres uniform after having such a good season, because Greenway's in the final year of his contract. And maybe he stays. Maybe the Sabres decide to overpay him. He makes $3 million a year. Do they want to give him $4 million? To me, that's an overpayment. But hey, maybe you want to do it just to keep a guy that was good for you and would fill a role in your bottom six. So we'll have a conversation about his future, though, down the road at some point. Let's get to GM candidates. I got a lot of names here to run through, some more likely than others. Some names that I hate the idea of. I got a section of today of just GMs like, nope, no chance. I hate it. We'll never support this at all. And I've got some up-and-coming names, although that might be a little less exciting to a Sabre fan right now to think of somebody that has never been in the job before becoming the GM. And again, all of this is predicated on the Sabres at some point would be willing to move on from Sabres general manager Kevyn Adams. That could be now. That could be after the season, whatever. This would be an if. A what if they move on from Kevyn Adams? What comes next? And what we should start with here, obviously, are the most likely replacements. What is most likely to happen if the Sabres move on from Adams? And by the way, that doesn't even mean they fire Adams. It could mean they bump him into another position. They could even name him like president of hockey operations just to take his finger off the button for trades and day-to-day operations and maybe more of a big picture type of if they want to keep him employed because they like Kevyn Adams, or maybe they kick him back into the business department. He could still be employed by the team and just no longer be general manager. But either way, this means not in the GM seat anymore. The most likely name, if you asked me to set betting odds on who would be the next Sabres general manager, I would set the favorite, and I might even think that this guy is more likely than the field. Like, I would set these odds at like minus 150, and the field to be like plus 150. Jason Karmanos, the associate general manager of the Buffalo Sabres, the general manager of the Rochester Americans, 50 years old. He has been in the NHL as an executive for 26 years. He has been in the NHL as an executive since he was 24. He is a sharp guy. He, I think most famously, is recognized with building the analytics department in Pittsburgh when he was the assistant GM there. But we're talking a long-time exec. First job was with the Carolina Hurricanes way back in the 90s as an executive VP of hockey operations and also an assistant general manager. And he was with Carolina for a long time. With Carolina from the 90s, would have started there. His first season, I believe, would have been 1998. Worked there all the way up until 2013. Then, after that, with Pittsburgh from 2014 to 2021. And again, kind of credited with helping build their hockey analytics department. And then he's been the Sabres associate GM since 2020. Now, Karmanos also, though, has been someone that I have seen get some buzz in past years, not necessarily recently, because the Sabres have gone downhill here, especially after 2 years ago when they missed the playoffs by 1 point. There was a little bit of buzz about him being a GM hired away from the Sabres on another club. And I think once the Sabres went downhill, that kind of went away. But he was a name, I think, that was on the radar for other organizations, and it just hasn't necessarily gone that direction. So Karmanos is somebody that, like, again, you compare him to where Adams came from when he was hired. Karmanos has more of a resume. This is a long time resume. This is a data-driven type of person. I wouldn't necessarily say he's done an incredible job in Rochester building that team. I think he's done a fine job building that team. So it's tough to evaluate sometimes an AHL team for that and how you would do at the NHL level. To me, though, he is definitively the most likely candidate to replace Kevyn Adams. I would be optimistic about him because of the data stuff, because of his, being a longtime NHL man. I think that he'd be more credible around hockey circles. I think with him and other GMs, I think him having his finger on the pulse a little bit as kind of the captain of the ship is a little bit of an appealing idea, which is why, like, when I hear, well, what's the point of firing Adams? They're just going to promote from within. I hear you. I understand wholeheartedly. Trust me, why that sentiment exists, right? The Sabres promoting from within is an eye roll, 100%, because they do it in so many other departments. This is the one spot, though, where I could get behind it because the person you be promoting has a pretty good resume. So Jason Karmanos is definitely the number one name to mention here. The other internal candidate that I will mention, and this would be a little bit more of a wild one, the Sabres going all in, Moneyball ideals, and going for the data guy, Sam Ventura. 36 years old. He is the Buffalo Sabres director of analytics, brought over from the Penguins. I mean, Karmanos built, if you will, the Penguins analytics department. Ventura was the Penguins analytics department. Like, he is the brains behind the operation. He is the one in the weeds. And of course, he has people working under him too. But Ventura, to me, would be a step towards we're going all in on the numbers. Not just the numbers guys have a seat at the table and they have a say in operations and they make suggestions and whatnot. Like, this would be the fundamentals of our decision-making are the numbers, are the data. And to me, that is different than what you have right now, where it's just an influence on the organization. So Sam Ventura, listen, like, this is one where I have not heard him talk before. I don't know much about him other than some of I've read about him, how he operates for the Sabres with the NHL draft and how high he was on Zach Benson and how he has different models that showed what Benson was as a prospect and other things. The Sabres have written some stories about him and his processy, which all looks impressive. The Penguins too, like I've read back a couple of years on some of the things that he did there. Like, very, very sharp guy, 100%. Is he the face of a franchise? Is he somebody that you would expect can go from just being locked in on the numbers and now he could go be a crude businessman from a GM position and go to other GMs and swing trades, get deals done, convince players to come here when that might not be the easiest thing in the world? Like, there is a lot else to the job, I think, other than just player evaluation. And that's where I almost feel like Karmanos up top with Ventura right under him might be a better structure. But that being said, Ventura being the Jonah Hill to Karmanos' Brad Pitt, if you will. That being said, if you just want to go hire Jonah Hill and just promote him, all right, I could get behind that because it would be unique. It would be different. And the other reason I could see the Sabres doing it is because it'd probably be pretty cheap, right? It'd be cheap. It's not a big name. It's not somebody that would require a big salary. If you're going more data intensive and less scouting, then, you can save money that way rather than having scouts fly all over the world. Like, data is going to be a cheaper way, I think, to do things. And maybe that appeals to the Buffalo Sabres, just kind of reading them. So Ventura, I don't think that they would do that, but it would excite me a little bit, I think, if they were to go all in on that type of guy. And then lastly, the one other internal candidate before we get to some external candidates, just to mention here, because we had one texter ask about him, Lindy Ruff. Lindy Ruff. Now, I don't love this idea. In fact, I kind of hate this idea. 64 years old, and of course, he is the head coach of the Buffalo Sabres. The reason I'm even mentioning Lindy here, and the only reason, is I have heard him a couple of times in the past say he is interested in being a GM someday. Now, it's been a long time since I've heard him say that, and he's never taken steps towards that. Even when he wasn't a head coach, he didn't go to the Rangers or some other organization and say, hey, can I start working my way up in the executive roles and somewhere in your hockey department? What did he do? He went and was the Rangers assistant coach. Like, he wanted to stay in coaching. So it would be somebody that's been in those rooms and I'm sure would know how to do the job. But he's just never done it. And he's never even been the guy underneath the guy that's done it. So Lindy, just to mention it here. And the other reason would be you would be keeping him active in the organization while promoting Seth Appert to head coach, which has always felt like that's what the Sabres want to do eventually. That after Lindy, Appert would be the coach. So this would be kind of accomplishing two things. You make your guy that you think could become the coach someday your coach, and you keep Lindy involved. That, though, I think is absolutely third amongst those internal ideas that I have. I don't love it, and I don't think the Sabres would do it anyway, but just thought it was worth a mention. Let's get to some external candidates when we come back. Veteran GMs and also up-and-coming GMs to get to when we come back here in the Locked On Sabres podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Sabres podcast is presented by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is, if you love sports, you are going to love Prize Picks, the best place to turn your sports knowledge into real money. Whether it's hockey, football, or any of your favorite sports, Prize Picks makes it easy to get in on the action. You can now win up to 1,000 times your money on Prize Picks. Plus, this holiday season, they're giving away $30+ million in rewards during Pickmas and offering 2 free picks in December. And when your picks hit, Prize Picks makes it easy to cash out. You can get your money in as fast as 15 minutes. So this week, check out Prize Picks. I'm eyeing. You could look at tomorrow night's Buffalo game, whether it is Tage Thompson, more or less than 1 point, shots on goal stuff for Alex Tuch. There's a lot available to you over on Prize Picks. Download the app today. Use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 instantly at Prize Picks. Prize Picks, run your game. Today's episode of Locked On Sabres is also presented by SelectQuote. Whether it's the Stanley Cup, the Super Bowl, the Olympics, the world's top athletes get to play in these top-level events thanks to one thing, teamwork. And teamwork can also protect your financial legacy and your family's future. SelectQuote's licensed insurance agents are the perfect teammates when shopping for customized, affordable life insurance. They can find you the right policy to keep your financial legacy safely in your family's net. SelectQuote, one of America's leading insurance brokers. Other life insurance brokers offer impersonal, one-size-fits-all policies that may cost you more or cover you less, while SelectQuote's licensed insurance agents work for you to tailor a life insurance policy for your individual needs in as little as 15 minutes. These policies are more affordable than you think. You could get coverage for up to $1 million for as little as $20 per month. Get the right life insurance for you for less at selectquote.com/lockedonnhl. Go to selectquote.com/lockedonnhl today to get started. It's selectquote.com/lockedonnhl. Back here on the Locked On Sabres podcast, we're talking GMs today. Little peek behind the curtain, by the way, if you're watching our show on YouTube. Going into that little break there, I got the mouse with the battery in it, and I never considered the possibility that the wireless mouse could die. And then what do? But we got it running again. So if you were wondering what that little pause was there. So anyways, let's get to some veteran GM ideas. Should get a wired mouse. Should get some veteran GM ideas for the Buffalo Sabres should they decide to move on from Kevyn Adams. And this is an area where I talked about on last show, mentioned Rick Dudley, who I'll lead off with today as one of these potential names. The Sabres have not hired a veteran general manager in at least 40 years. Scotty Bowman was the last Sabres GM that had previous GM experience in the NHL. And he was the coach. I have to go way back in the records and find out like how that all transitioned, but he was the coach who became the GM. It's not like they hired him as the GM. So they really almost have never done it. Punch Imlach, right? Do I have to go back to their original general manager for this? They have never done it. They've never done it. Kevyn Adams was not a previous GM, not even close. Jason Botterill was not a previous GM in the league. Neither was Tim Murray. Neither was Darcy Regier. Neither was John Muckler. Just they have not had a GM like that. They have not taken that avenue. So, what about that? That to me is an idea that has never sounded more appealing than it does right now, is hiring somebody that's been there, done that, and has been in the job before. And I talked a little bit about Rick Dudley yesterday, just to briefly mention him again here. 75 years old. He is currently Florida's senior advisor, former Buffalo Sabres player in the 1970s and into the 1980s, former Sabres head coach in the early 1990s, Rick Dudley. He has been the general manager for 4 different franchises. Most recently, it's been a while since he was the GM. He was the assistant GM in Montreal for many years under Marc Bergevin. He's been the senior advisor in Florida for a few years. He was last the GM in Atlanta. The last Atlanta Thrasher season, Dudley was the GM before they moved to Winnipeg, and then they hired somebody new because the team moved. In that final year in Atlanta, it did not necessarily go great for the Thrashers. They were not a very good hockey team, but they took swings, and that is kind of what he went for. They finished, by the way, 34, 36, and 12. So they were an 80-point team the last time he was a GM in the league. That team had traded for, off the defending Stanley Cup champion Chicago Blackhawks, Andrew Ladd and Dustin Byfuglien. The last time Dudley was a GM, he took some big swings to go after some great players like Ladd and Byfuglien. Byfuglien probably worked out more so than Ladd did, but both guys kept playing into once they moved to Winnipeg, and were both very good players for a very long time for them. So Atlanta, that is the last thing you have to go on for Dudley. He lives locally. He lives in Lewiston. 75 years old. You'd have a question about, does he still feel like he has the energy to run a hockey department? But Dudley is a name to mention here again as somebody that has a connection to the organization, which might help you land him. That being said, I do not know his relationship with the organization. Some former players don't have a good relationship with the Buffalo Sabres. I don't know what his relationship is with Terry Pegula, even if there is one. So I can guess that the Buffalo connection helps, but sometimes it could actually hurt, and I don't know where that would stand with Dudley. Other veteran GM ideas. I've mentioned, the name I always mention when this comes up is Brian Burke. Well, let's get into a little bit more about Brian Burke specifically, because he's available. In theory, he's not in the NHL. That is what you would say by he's available. He is 69 years old, so 6 years younger than Dudley. He is presently the executive director of the Professional Women's Hockey League Players Association. So he is kind of leading that charge for the players in that league right now. And he's done a lot of, very cool ventures or job titles, I think, that have not been him in the NHL. I think this job title certainly would be described as that. I've liked Brian Burke for him standing up for women's hockey in the past. He also has done a lot of other ventures that I've been impressed with outside of the NHL. But let's talk about him in the NHL. He's been in the NHL since 1987. Brian Burke is like the NHL exec, right? He is as experienced as it gets. 1987, 15 years as a general manager for Vancouver, for Anaheim, also for the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Toronto stint did not necessarily go that great. He won the Stanley Cup with Anaheim as the GM in 2007. He built that team. And he's famous for some big trades, right? Like he's famous for way back when he was the architect that made all of those trades and moved all around the draft board to get both Sedins on the Vancouver Canucks. Some that didn't even go well, right? Like he is the one that traded Tyler Seguin and other stuff to Boston to get Phil Kessel in Toronto. Dion Phaneuf as well. Like he was somebody that got deals done and tried to make some big trades. So there's that. I believe, I want to double check this real quick. He is the one that brought Chris Pronger to the Anaheim Ducks. Yes, 2006. Kind of that final piece, big trade, and helped them propel them to win the Stanley Cup in 2007. Brian Burke knows how to get deals done. He is a shrewd GM. I think he is the right personality for this job right now, because I think you kind of have to be that way when you're punching up, right? Like you're trying to attract players to come here. You're trying to negotiate with other GMs that might be trying to take advantage of you right now. That's happening with Kevyn Adams. There was a report from Frank Saravelli today that multiple teams have made firm offers for Sabre players, and they haven't even received counters on that. And what does that mean? It probably means that other GMs are trying to take advantage of Kevyn Adams because of how it's going. And Brian Burke is someone I would not imagine you could take advantage of like that. His most recent job in the NHL was president of hockey operations from 2020 to 2023 with the Pittsburgh Penguins. And Ron Hextall was his GM underneath him, and that was a pretty poor hire, if you ask me. So the most recent job that he's had, not that impressive. Calgary before that, not that impressive. So this is not an idea that I would think has to go well. And there'd be a lot of things I'm sure he would do roster-wise that would drive me bananas. But it is the credible, lifelong executive that the Sabres have not really even... This is the one thing they haven't tried. They haven't tried to hire a guy like this. They have not hired a guy like this in decades, if they've even done it since the 70s. So Brian Burke, he does have a job right now, and maybe he would prefer to stay there if the Sabres came calling, but somebody that... I feel like I'd be a little bit excited if they went after. Other veteran GMs, quickly to run through some bad ideas. Guys that I would just want no part of, because I think the only reason, like Burke, I think you would bring in, and I think you could get some good moves. I think you'd have some bad too, but I wouldn't just assume everything would go terribly. There are a few veteran GMs where if they got hired, I would assume it would go terribly, because I don't think they have any clue how to evaluate players. Ken Holland, no chance. 30 years of GM experience, Detroit and Edmonton. The game has passed Ken Holland by tenfold. Want no part of Ken Holland as the Sabres GM. Marc Bergevin, 10-year GM in Montreal. He's currently the senior advisor with the LA Kings. I want no part of Marc Bergevin. Same thing. Ridiculously bad trades, terrible player evaluation. The Montreal Canadiens are still trying to recover from his terrible roster decision-making near the end of his career there. Ron Hextall, who I just mentioned, was below Brian Burke in Pittsburgh. Flyers GM before that. Penguins 2020 to 23. He had some bad moves. Trading Mike Matheson for Jeff Petrie. Trading John Marino for nothing off the Penguins. There was a thing at the last expansion draft where they traded away Jared McCann and they lost Brandon Tanev so that they could protect Jeff Carter at like 50 years old. Just terrible player evaluation decisions from Ron Hextall. Not a GM that I want any part of. Hextall, Bergevin, Holland, and then the taker of the cake. No way, no how, never want anything to do with him. Former GM in Boston, former GM in Edmonton, long time. And actually, weirdly, he must be friends with like Bettman or something, because I've heard on podcasts and written before, Bettman has worked to get him jobs again, recommended him for GM jobs. Peter Chiarelli, former Bruins GM, former Oilers GM. He's currently the VP of hockey operations in St. Louis. Some of the worst trades in NHL history from this guy. Taylor Hall for Adam Larson. Jordan Eberle for Ryan Strome, Tyler Seguin for Riley Smith and Louis Erickson, Blake Wheeler for Rich Peverly, sending away the draft pick that became Matt Barzell, plus other stuff to draft Griffin Reinhart, signing Milan Lucic to a massive contract when he was shot. Terrible decision after terrible decision after terrible decision. To me, he is the worst general manager in NHL history. And he has experience. Great. He has bad experience. I want no part of him as the GM. Those are 4 names that I feel like could come up if the Sabres had a vacancy that I would all want to say, no. I know I want experience, but this is bad experience. No part of those 4. I would separate Dudley. I would separate Burke. If you got another name that kind of fits that profile, like to me, there aren't many of those terrible GM ideas out there. Those would definitely be 4 of them. When we come back quickly, some up-and-coming GM ideas if the Sabres were to fire Kevyn Adams. We'll have that for you next year on the Locked On Sabres podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Sabres podcast is presented by FanDuel Sportsbook. Sabres are a slight underdog tomorrow at home against Toronto. They a lot of times beat Toronto in games they shouldn't here at home. So you can check that out. Get ready to tackle all NHL action and the rest of the NFL action this season on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. Hey, maybe you want to use that on an emotional hedge. Maybe you want to bet against Buffalo tomorrow just because if they lose, then at least you win something. FanDuel Sportsbook app will give you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, we've got a couple more names for you here on the Locked On Sabres podcast as Kevyn Adams still the GM, and maybe he will be for a long time still. But I feel like we are kind of waiting around to see if they'll keep him and see when they'll fire him. And I cannot imagine if they're going to be one of the worst teams in the league this year that he is going to survive. But you never know. If they move on, we've gone through some veteran names, whether it is, of course, Brian Burke or whether it is Rick Dudley or others. Internal, I think Jason Karmanos is most likely. I mentioned Sam Ventura as an idea as well. What about up-and-coming GM ideas? Guys that have been working as executives in the league but have not yet got a crack at the big gig. Couple of names, doing some research on who these guys could be. Let's start down in Tampa. Matthew Darch, 48 years old, Tampa Bay assistant GM. He's been in Tampa for 5 years now, since 2019. He's had the titles of director of hockey operations as well as assistant general manager. Just doing a little bit of research on him. What you're getting from Darch, maybe if your favorite type of idea would be a capologist, somebody that would do good contract negotiations, that maybe would have good workarounds to figure out deals for free agents that would look attractive for guys to come here, budgeting, figuring out the salary cap. This would be if you believe they are willing to spend to the cap, by the way, which might be tough to buy. But Matthew Darch would be your guy. 48 years old, up-and-coming GM from the Tampa Bay organization. He is a name to watch as an up-and-coming GM in the league. If the Sabres don't hire him, it feels like I've read enough about him that he would get a job somewhere else eventually. Lawrence Gilman, 59 years old, is another name that I'll mention here. More so because, not because he's like a young up-and-coming guy. He's 59 years old. More so because this is it kind of fits both categories. It's a first-time GM, but it's an experienced first-time GM, if that makes sense. And that, to me, is what the Sabres should be looking for, is an experienced hockey man. And Lawrence Gilman is currently the Toronto Marlies senior vice president of hockey operations. He has been with the Maple Leafs organization, though, for many years. In fact, he's been in the NHL as an executive since 1998. He has been in the title of assistant GM from 2001 to 2022 until this most recent job title with the Marlies. Time with Toronto, time with Vancouver, before that Phoenix. He's been an assistant GM for a very long time. He would have relationships. I read that he was one that Bill Daley, the deputy commissioner, went to help design expansion rules for, because they respect him in the league as a very sharp and bright mind. So in this one, you'd be getting an experienced general manager, but also a first-time general manager. So I'll mention him. I don't know what his status is right now, given that he's working for the Marlies and not technically the Leafs anymore by his job title, although I'm sure it's still kind of both. Just a name to mention because he kind of fits both categories. I got one other name from the Leafs organization, by the way. Haley Wickenheiser, or I should say Dr. Haley Wickenheiser, Hall of Famer, longtime women's hockey player, 5-year Olympian, played in Europe's men's league, assistant GM in Toronto, 46 years old, up and coming. I've seen her mentioned a bunch of times about up and coming GM ideas, and looking what her responsibilities in Toronto, oversees prospects for the Maple Leafs, assesses young talent in the National Hockey League, an up and coming GM in the league that I think maybe could get a job in the next couple of years, and maybe the Sabres would be a good idea to give her first crack at it. So Haley Wickenheiser, another name to mention here. And then I wanted to mention a couple of former Sabres, because what do teams often do in the NHL? They'll hire their former players to come run the show. The tough thing here is the Sabres' former players are already employed. Mike Greer is already the GM of the Sharks. Danny Briere is already the GM of the Flyers. Chris Drury is the GM of the Rangers, and I never believed Drury would ever work for this organization anyways. I got asked about that. Drury's getting heat in New York. Like, hey, if Chris Drury gets fired, what about him? No chance. I would never in a million years believe that he would come back and work here. There aren't really any other former Sabres that are like on the rise. You're too early in the process for a couple of guys out in San Jose that I'll mention here. Thomas Vanek is a scout for the San Jose Sharks, but he only has been for 2 years. So that doesn't even really, it's not like it's a scout. It's not even really executive experience. So I don't think anyway there. Ryan Miller. I would bet you sometime in the next 2 decades, Ryan Miller will eventually be the Buffalo Sabres GM, because he has said, kind of like Lindy used to say, I've heard Miller a couple times say he wants to be a GM in the NHL someday, but not right now. He's got no experience, 0 experience. I don't know that he'd have any clue how to do it. So, like Danny Briere worked in the Flyers organization for many years before he got that job. Greer and Drury too, like they worked their way up. Miller has not done that yet. So you're too early in the process for guys like that. And the only other name that came to mind for me among like a former player idea that has a connection to the team, Miroslav Shatan. Miroslav Shatan, 50 years old. He is currently the president of the Slovakian Ice Hockey Federation, and he has been for several years. He is their GM for like all international tournaments. At least that's what his resume says. So he is evaluating players. He also was the GM of Team Europe for the World Cup of Hockey in 2016, where he would have been evaluating NHL talent. So Miro Shatan, listen, that would be kind of different. It would be unique, right? Remember when the Sabres were looking for head coaches like way back when, and we would mention Rickard Gronberg, a Swedish coach. Like, hey, the NHL never hires coaches out of Europe. That's different. That's unique. Let's try that. This would kind of be that. This would be, I'm hiring now Shatan, like over, like it's been 5, 6, 7 years. He's an experienced executive in hockey, but in Europe, not the NHL. So it's kind of different. And I don't know how much respect, how credible that would be. But he is a former Buffalo Sabre. He has executive experience, despite the fact that it's different executive experience. But he's run hockey departments, even if it's in Slovakia. Miller, Vanek, like these guys, they have not run a business like that. Shatan has. So maybe he is somebody that's worth a mention here. I'll say this, though. Almost every name I've mentioned since Jason Karmanos is not that likely. Is a long shot. Every one of these names is probably a long shot. Maybe the most likely would be the up-and-coming guys, Matthew Darche in Tampa, would be like the second most likely name that we've mentioned here today. You're kind of, you're throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall and you're hoping that one of them sticks if it's not going to be Karmanos. But that's about as deep as I could go on these ideas until they were to eventually fire him, and then maybe we would see some stuff leak out about what they're looking for. I think this is about as far as it goes. But if you've got an idea, someone that we didn't mention here today, or somebody that you think deserves more expansion on, you can hit us up, Text Club, or on our Twitter, or on Blue Sky. A bunch of different ways to get involved. Hit us up. Who do you think would be your favorite idea to replace Kevyn Adams should he be fired by the Buffalo Sabres? All right. That is going to do it for us today here on the Locked On Sabres podcast. The Sabres and the Maple Leafs on Friday. We should really dive in on how embarrassing will it be Friday night? We should talk. We'll definitely talk about that game tomorrow. We'll preview it and the weekend ahead as well. So we'll talk to you tomorrow here on the Locked On Sabres podcast. Check out Locked On Bills with Joe Marino ahead of this Sunday against New England. And of course, Locked On Fantasy Hockey, Steal and Flip. They've got you covered throughout the week for your daily tips and tricks. Talk to you tomorrow here on the Locked On Sabres podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.